arsip kita. Oke, kita mulai saja. Ini sudah mulai banyak yang berdatangan. Terima kasih. Selamat malam dari Surabaya. Good morning to Phillip in Kansas, Lawrence, and good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon or good morning in Leiden to Judith dan Pak Suaigit. Selamat malam di Porong. Jadi ini adalah seri. Saya akan membuka dengan bahasa Indonesia. Jadi ini adalah seri keempat dari rangkaian diskusi dengan judul besarnya adalah bencana industrial dan keadilan sosial ekologis. Nah, kegiatan ini adalah kegiatan inisiatif yang dari banyak pihak dan menjadi organisasinya adalah perkumpulan Judith, tapi juga didukung oleh Posko Kakalula dan tim kerja perempuan dan tambang, ada Jatam, ada Walhi, ada Sayogyo Institute, dan kemudian dari pihak kampus juga ada Magister Kebencanaan, UPN Veteran, Yogyakarta, Pusat Studi Kebumian dan Kebencanaan Universitas Brawijaya, dan juga kelompok studi lingkungan dan bencana sosial di Universitas Brawijaya. Dan kemudian acara ini juga didukung oleh IFIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies, yang juga mempublikasikan ini acara-acara kami. Saya perlu mengingatkan bahwa pada hari ini kita akan mendapatkan tamu istimewa dari Kansas University, Phillip. Dia menulis sebuah buku Indonesia and the Politics of Disaster, dan secara spesifik dia membahas tentang isu Lapindo. Dia dan juga ada Judith Bosnak dari Leiden University, dan juga yang tak kalah spesial juga ada Pak Suaigit dari Gedang. Pak Suaigit ini adalah seorang warga Porong. Ya, dia pendatang di Porong, cuman dia sudah lama di situ dan saat ini dia masih tinggal di situ. Jadi judul pertemuan kita malam hari ini dari Indonesia itu adalah Decolonizing Lapindo Science, Knowledge, Power, and Legacies of Misinformation, atau kemudian saya terjemahkan dekolonisasi pengetahuan Lapindo, knowledge, pengetahuan, kekuasaan, dan warisan dari misinformasi. Jadi kita akan membahas dari perspektif bagaimana sains tentang Lapindo itu diciptakan atau dihasilkan, dan bagaimana kita akan mendekolonisasi, usaha-usaha untuk melakukan dekolonisasi atau melawan penjajahan pengetahuan tentang Lapindo yang dibuat oleh para ilmuwan. Jadi tadi siang juga sudah ada diskusi terkait dengan colonizations of knowledge, dan juga bagaimana dekolonisasi bersama Niels Buban dan juga Suraya Afif dari UI, Niels Buban dari Aarhus University, dan kita berharap kita bisa memperkaya dengan secara spesifik tentang kasus Lapindo, tentang bagaimana dekolonisasi pengetahuan tentang Lapindo ini kita gunakan. Bersama saya ada Mbak Siti Maimunah dan Mas Catur sebagai konvener bersama. Bulan depan masih ada satu rangkaian terakhir bersama Hendro Sangkoyo, juga bercerita tentang dekolonisasi cakap bencana, potret forensik, dan jalan cerita tandingan. Akan ada Rita Padawangi dari Singapore University of Social Science sebagai penanggapnya. Nah, untuk mempersingkat waktu, saya akan masuk pertama ke Pak Suaigit dulu tentang testimoni. Mungkin Pak Suaigit bisa cerita Pak Suaigit itu posisinya seperti apa sekarang, atau Pak Suaigit itu siapa dan seperti apa? Mungkin silakan di unmute dulu, Pak.
Iya.
Atau mungkin ya, oke. Silakan.
Ya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. dan selamat malam untuk teman-teman yang sudah hadir. Perkenalkan dulu, nama saya Suaigit Ruslin Tri Cahyono. Asli saya lahir di Lamongan. Kemudian di tahun 1990 saya sudah berada di Sidoarjo. Tahun 1990 sudah berada di Sidoarjo. Kemudian 1991 saya di Banyuwangi. 1995 saya di Jember dan Tanggul Lumajang. 1997 saya kembali lagi ke Sidoarjo. Seiring dengan turunnya Bapak Presiden Soeharto dulu.
Oh, jadi ini pelaku sejarah juga nih, keluyuran. Pak Sigit bisa cerita sedikit tentang situasi rumah Pak Sigit sekarang di Gedang seperti apa, lingkungannya dan segala macam.
Oh, iya, terima kasih. Kalau sekarang ini kondisi lingkungan di tempat saya ini ya alhamdulillah sudah membaik, karena biarpun bagaimana yang namanya bencana harus kita sikapi secara positif dan kita tetap selalu membangun lingkungan yang terbaik, karena mau tidak mau kita tetap berdampingan dengan lumpur Lapindo. Kemudian tetek bengeknya, efek sampingnya juga sudah kita rasakan, dan alhamdulillah sekarang sudah jarang-jarang sekali, terutama untuk baunya maupun untuk lumpurnya yang dulu sempat masuk di wilayah Gedang, Pak Nino.
Oke, jadi mungkin Pak Sigit bisa cerita tentang pengalaman mengetahui apa yang terjadi di lingkungan sekitar jenengan atau Anda Pak Sigit di Gedang ataupun juga sekitar lumpur Lapindo.
Ya, terima kasih. Pengalaman yang saya ketahui ketika terjadinya semburan lumpur itu memang waktu itu kecil, ya, kecil, dan fenomena itu tidak pernah saya lihat atau saya ketahui, baru itu yang saya ketahui. Lama kelamaan sumber lumpur Lapindo itu ternyata besar dan sangat menghebohkan dunia itu. Sampai sekarang masih menyisakan permasalahan-permasalahan yang belum selesai. Tetapi sepengetahuan saya itu hanya sebatas tahu itu adalah semburan lumpur, tapi masalah geologinya saya tidak tahu karena belum ada kepastian riset yang membuktikan bahwa geologi di sekitar Porong ini apa aman atau tidak, ini tidak resmi atau tidak saya ketahui gitu, Mas.
Nah, kalau Pak Sigit sendiri selama ini bersama siapa untuk mengetahui dan tentang situasi saat ini?
Ya, kapasitas saya di lingkungan adalah sebagai Ketua RT, Pak Nino, Ketua RT 11 yang lokasinya atau wilayahnya sudah terkena dampak lumpur Lapindo tapi di luar peta area. Jadi sudah selesai pembayarannya. Jadi saya termasuk Ketua RT yang mengawal sekaligus merealisasikan AJB maupun IJB pada bangunan tanah dan bangunan. Itu ketua RT saya yang mengawal seperti itu. Dan saya di komunitas ini saya sebagai koordinator wilayah Gedang. Artinya itu suatu ketika saya bisa mobilisasi warga untuk mendapatkan informasi ataupun sosialisasi dari pemerintahan desa, pemerintahan kabupaten, ataupun dari BPLS. Begitu, Mas Nino.
Nah, kalau boleh tahu Pak Sigit, lingkungan di sekitar Pak Sigit itu sekarang seperti apa ya? Ini kan teman-teman dari banyak tempat ya, banyak lokasi, dan mungkin bisa cerita situasi di sana seperti apa sekarang?
Iya. Sekarang lokasi yang sudah dibebaskan itu penanganan sosial dengan jual beli atau pembelian tanah dan bangunan sekarang sudah kosong, Mas Nino, posisinya, dan sudah dipagar tembok sama PPLS. Nah, di dalam pagar tembok itu sekarang itu sudah tumbuh, maaf, ya memang sudah ada penanganan dari PPLS yaitu dengan penanaman termasuk salubin atau term besi. Memang tujuannya untuk menyerap karbon dioksida di lumpur ini sudah ada penanaman seperti itu. Tapi setelah ditanam tidak ada perawatan sama sekali, yang sehingga di sekitar tanaman itu tumbuh yang namanya rumput gelagah itu sangat tinggi sekali sampai mencapai 4 meter tingginya. Dan ketika musim kemarau kemarin itu terjadi kebakaran 3 kali. Dan itu memang yang bakar itu nggak tahu kok moro-moro ada kebakaran. Akhirnya mendatangkan damkar dari wilayah Porong yang berada di pasar itu 3 kali, Mas Dino. Dan itu persis di belakangnya kantor polisi itu yang kebakaran itu. Jadi kami sebagai warga yang masih tersisa di sebelah timurnya pembebasan tanah itu ya tetap Mas Dino was-was karena apa? Begitu tingginya rumput-rumput itu khawatir. Ya, ketika musim hujan ataupun hari-hari biasa kemudian ada ular di situ. Ular itu tempo hari itu ada beberapa orang itu sampai nangkap itu yang namanya ular kobra itu ada. Itu bentuk tidak bohong, ada itu. Malah yang namanya hewan regul rase itu ada yang berkoloni itu ada di situ. Ada. Jadi sekarang ini posisi di wilayah saya itu ya sudah tertutup tembok dan juga belum ada penanganan PPLS untuk bagaimana di sekitar tanamannya beliau itu bisa bersih dan bisa dilihat dan dipandang gitu loh, Pak Deno.
Ya, kalau boleh tahu Pak, yang sering didengar oleh kawan-kawan itu kan juga terkait ini ya air katanya ini ya sulit ya di sana dan situasinya sudah buruk ya. Nah, mungkin Pak Sigit bisa cerita situasi air dan juga udara di situ dan juga mungkin kesehatan warga di sekitar itu seperti apa sekarang?
Iya. Kondisi air ketika di awal Lumur Lapindo sebelum wilayah RT 10 itu mengajukan ke 45 RT yang masuk di luar peta dampak peta area, itu memang kondisi airnya itu berwarna kuning. Nah, dari warna kuning itu pemerintah desa sudah mengupayakan dulu sempat ngebor yang tujuannya itu mendapatkan air yang bersih, tapi ternyata sama kuningnya waktu dulu. Ya, sehingga ketika dikonsumsi tidak bisa, Mas Nino. Akhirnya beli air yang lewat jerigen itu beli. Nah, kemudian ketika untuk mencuci, untuk mandi, nah ini kalau mandi masih bisa, tapi sudah berkumpul-kumpul untuk sikatan ini kadang-kadang juga tidak mau mereka. Dan untuk mencuci baju itu kadang-kadang yang baju putih itu jadi kuning dulu itu dan bau awal dulu. Nah, akhirnya RT 10 itu kan mengajukan dari 45 RT itu. Nah, mengajukan ya melalui rapat minta persetujuan. Tapi RT-RT yang lain itu tidak mengajukan, hanya 10 itu yang mengajukan. Tapi ternyata disikat dari RT 10 sampai ke Baldesa ke arah selatan. Ya itu terjadi seperti itu. Nah, karena apa? Karena RT 10 itu kondisinya airnya sudah kuning, akhirnya akhirnya ikut masuk di Perpres yang 45 RT dulu. Karena ya banjir juga di situ. Air mampet karena di RT 10 itu kan dulu kan ada saluran air yang menuju ke Jatirjo untuk pengaliran sawah. Lah itu buntu, akhirnya banjir dulu. Tapi sekarang dari gregetnya warga berdasarkan pengalaman dan kejadian di lapangan, akhirnya mengajukan proposal dan dulu sudah dibuatkan saluran air yang bisa menampung dan menyalurkan air hujan. Itu sudah alhamdulillah. Sekarang setiap hujan deras tetap banjir di lokasi RT 11 tetap 11, 13, kemudian di RT 14 tetap banjir itu tetap, tapi sebentar paling-paling 2 jam habis itu. Tapi kalau di RT 2, ya di RT 3, RT 4, RT 5, kemudian sebagian RT 6 itu pasti banjir setiap ada hujan. Kenapa? karena melubernya Kali Simo yang di sebelah timur Gedang itu, Mas Nino.
Kalau itu kan air, jadi air sudah nggak bisa dikonsumsi. Kalau udara gimana Pak Sigit?
Nah, kalau udaranya, kalau menurut survei ataupun praktek yang kita jalankan bersama-sama melalui eco checker ataupun plat tembaga dan perak itu di kondisi Gedang memang ada sedikit warna agak gelap untuk untuk tembaga dan peraknya itu. Tetapi sekarang ini rupa-rupanya Mas Nino sudah berkurang untuk baunya ataupun hampir jarang saya mencium baunya jarang. Karena mungkin arah angin ataupun kondisinya mungkin dari lumpur Lapindo ini sudah mulai surut mungkin. Karena apa? Karena ketika saya jalan-jalan di pembuangan di Kali Porong itu rupanya kok agak-agak berupa air itu sudah surut rupanya lumpur. Begitu Mas Nino.
Kalau kesehatan warga gimana? Saya dengar ada banyak kejadian-kejadian terkait dengan kesehatan di sekitar situ. Apakah ada
terima kasih.
kelainan
untuk
gitu?
Tren di wilayah Gedang ya memang perhatian khusus baik dari tingkat kelurahan maupun dari Pokesmas, sehingga beliau yang belum mendapatkan KIS maupun belum mendapatkan kartu sehat diusahakan semua melalui RT dan melalui kelurahan. Jadi kalau dulu itu karena bau ya sehingga menyebabkan sesak, menyebabkan gangguan pernapasan, tapi sekarang alhamdulillah kejadian-kejadian yang seperti meninggal yang tempo dulu saya ceritakan mendadak ini juga sudah ada. Memang meninggal itu sudah takdir, tapi kan ya kita selidiki kan gitu.
Oke. Ya, terima kasih Pak Suaigit. Ini kita itu kan sudah masuk ke tahun ke-15, 15 tahun semburan lumpur Lapindo. Nah, kita dengar dari Pak Sigit tentang situasi-situasi terkini, kondisi di lapangan bahwa air di sana sudah tidak bisa dikonsumsi, udara juga kadang-kadang bau dan tergantung arah mata angin. Soal tidak berbau lagi mungkin hidungnya juga sudah kebal, saya nggak tahu. Dan juga terkait dengan kondisi kesehatan warga. Nah, terima kasih Pak Sigit. Nah, saya akan bergeser kepada Phillip Drake. So I will shift to Phillip Drake. Hello Phillip, good morning.
Hello Nino, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for having this being here in our conversation. So from Pak Sigit, we heard that there are so many changes in the environment surrounding the mud flow. I mean, the water quality, we cannot, the people there cannot consume the water, and the air also, sometimes it's very odor, bau, and then there are some gas, we don't know what contains in the air. And then also there are some problems with health, public health. So there are so many high rate of, for instance, respiratory problems. So, and then the recent health monitoring was there are kandung kemih, intestinal, sorry. So there are some health issue in Porong. So now your presentation will talk about how we decolonize the Lapindo science. So I don't know if you are, I mean, your talk will probably more about the geological debates and also the social and ecological effect of the mud flow. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I just want to begin by conveying my gratitude for being here today. That's a true honor. And my gratitude also, especially to you, Pak Nino and Pak Chatur, for all of your correspondence over the years. It's been immensely valuable and useful for the work that I've been doing. I've got to turn on my slideshow. Sorry about that. I'm actually not sure how to. Oh, I need to share. Okay, sorry. Okay. Hopefully, is this visible?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay,
you make
great.
full screen?
Full screen. I will try to do that. Sorry for my confusion on this. Oops. Shoot.
Slideshow, yeah, play from the start.
Slideshow. Perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you for your patience on that. I also apologize that I know I'm presenting in English and my Bahasa Indonesia, it's very bad. I used to be okay, but it's been several years since I've been in Indonesia and I have pretty much forgotten all of it. So apologies for that, and apologies because this presentation is going to go a little bit into some nuances in language that if you're not a fluent English speaker might be difficult to follow, but I'm happy to clarify as things go along. I planned a more like a 45-minute talk, but in preparation or in the minutes before coming on here, I heard it should be closer to 30. So I'm going to condense a few things. So I will just let you know that there's a lot more that I could be presenting on regarding this, but I'm just going to begin by giving a brief outline of this presentation. It's going to survey a series of influential studies by scientists loosely affiliated with Lapindo Brontes, identifying a pattern of spreading misleading information about what first triggered the Lapindo mud flow and the mud flow's social and ecological effects. I'm going to begin by highlighting two recent noteworthy studies that have circulated falsehoods and disinformation. In doing so, I will be observing certain patterns in rhetoric and communication that enable inaccurate information to flourish. These studies have been influential in shaping government responses to the disaster, from investigations to disaster management operations. And by promoting a narrative that shields Lapindo Brontes from responsibility, these studies also have undermined efforts by victims to receive justice and prevent unsafe mining in the future. So despite glaring flaws in many of these studies, several of which will be outlined in this presentation, professional journals continue to publish these scientists' reports, which raises broader questions about power and ethics within international scientific institutions. I'm going to conclude by asking whether it might be possible to decolonize Lapindo science and consider what inquiry about geological, environmental, and human systems might look like outside of the hierarchies of power that often permeate mainstream international science. By paying closer attention to knowledge gathering activities of victims, residents, activists, and others who have been touched by the disaster, alternative models of decolonized science might emerge to provide more accurate and nuanced information about disasters. Beyond advancing safety, equity, and resiliency among communities affected by the mud flow, these locally oriented scientific practices might provide lessons that could help vulnerable populations facing hazards throughout the world. So the best part about presenting this research to an Indonesian audience with Indonesian scholars is that I do not have to introduce the disaster. I don't have to talk about 10 minutes about what it actually is. So I'm going to skip that. I'm just going to actually jump into a recent study that was released a couple months ago, actually. It was a study that was, let's see, published by a research team headed by Adriano Mazzini. If you're not familiar with Mazzini, he is a geologist who has been studying the geophysical side of the disaster since 2007. He is also the head of a research group called the Lucy Lab, and they've been conducting research on, again, the kind of geophysical side of the disaster for about 10 years now, with a really nice grant to conduct this research. In this new article, Mazzini and his team write about the methane emissions at the Lapindo mudflow. And this is in the discussion about gases earlier. This is, I think, a really important thing. And it's frustrating that this research is coming so late in the game, even though we know that this gas has been being emitted for quite a long time. What's interesting about this argument, and problematic, at least about the Mazzini study, is that it has actually nothing to do with Lapindo. Instead, it uses methane measurements from Lapindo to argue against a different study about methane emissions. And I'm going to just give you a brief overview of this earlier study. And I'm really bad at charts, so I apologize for my visual here. But Mazzini's target is Benjamin Hamiel's recent study that found that natural, that is non-anthropogenic methane emissions is lower than previously estimated. Earlier estimates indicated that 8% of yearly methane emissions came from natural sources. And that's, if you see on this page, the left model is the old model, where that blue chunk is 8% of the total methane emissions. The Hamiel study finds that the number is actually closer to 2%. And this is an important thing because it means that, so the Hamiel study is the chart on the right side. With the blue reduced to 2%, that means there's an extra 6% of methane emissions that's being produced by humans, by agriculture, fossil fuel extraction. It means basically that it's even more important now to make sure that there's interventions done to control methane emissions. Mazzini, on the other hand, argues against this second slide, saying that Hamiel's measurements are inaccurate for 3 reasons. 1, Lapindo alone is releasing the same amount of methane as all natural emissions. It's basically that 2% slice that I showed you. 2, other degassing mud volcanoes release a similar amount as Lapindo, which further undermines Hamiel's claim. And 3, methane release, quote, around Lucy's crater is comparable to that of major leaks related to the fossil fuel industry. Now, to me, this is really, really interesting that they're actually comparing the Lapindo to an industrial disaster, but treating it as if it's a natural disaster. It doesn't make a lot of sense. At the bottom of this visual, I have this contrast between showing and telling. And this is something that as a teacher, when we're training new researchers, students learning how to write, we talk about showing versus telling. It's really, really important to, if you're going to tell somebody something in an argument, in a research project, to make sure that you have evidence that shows that what you're telling is accurate. If you tell somebody something, but are unable to show them that it's accurate, it's hollow rhetoric. And so I could tell you, for instance, I'm a really good singer, but unless I'm able to show you with a beautiful voice, it doesn't mean anything, right? So what they're doing is telling us one thing, but showing us something completely different in this Mazzini study. A more straightforward interpretation. So a more straightforward interpretation would actually arrive at the opposite conclusion, that since Lapindo's emissions are similar to those of an industrial accident, it's actually caused by drilling, and in fact is an industrial accident. And therefore the bundle of methane that's released that they're calculating into the natural category should actually be in the human category, which basically means that they are not disproving the Hamil study. So they're telling us, I've added a new sliver here. So the blue sliver on the left chart is the 2% natural emissions that Hamil has said is coming up every year from the natural methane emissions. The Mazzini study says this green sliver is the amount that Lapindo is producing every year, and therefore the natural emissions must be much higher than 2% and maybe even closer to 10%. The problem is Mazzini is using, his whole argument is contingent on the fact, or relies upon the fact that he's treating Lapindo as if it's a natural disaster, which doesn't make any sense. And he himself in this article compares it to an industrial disaster. So they're telling us one thing, they're showing us another. This is really important to emphasize, and it might sound a little bit simple, but studies like these can have a lot of power when it comes to policy, because it has, if a policy person reads an article like Mazzini's and thinks, oh, well, actually, natural emissions, if it's producing so much, maybe it's okay for us to do more fossil fuel mining because there's less of an impact. And so these can be really, really dangerous. And so it sounds like a very kind of dense, abstract argument, but it has real dangerous consequences. And this is basically just a summary of what I just told you. To me, and this is what drives me crazy when reading this article, and again, it was only a couple months ago that it just came out, is that we've known that there's lots of methane that's being released around Lapindo for a very long time. The question is really uninteresting to ask, like how much of it is contributing to natural. It's an interesting question, but it's not an important question to the people with the most at stake with the mud flow. To me, the important question, and one that Mazzini's team hasn't asked, and I doubt they'll ever ask, is why isn't Lapindo Brontes being held accountable for the methane emissions that it's causing? What would penalties and compensation for methane emissions look like? What if they took seriously this kind of pollution? So before I go on to the next article, I just want to highlight one more thing, and I apologize that it's a little bit hard to see in this excerpt from this article, and I've highlighted weird sections of it for my own sake, so I apologize for that as well. But if you go into the middle here, where it says, Lucy is a hybrid sediment-hosted geothermal system triggered on the 27th May 2006, Java earthquake, numerous mud bursting vents appeared on the 29th of May 2006. Again, you see very explicitly that they are treating this like a natural disaster. It's presented as if there wasn't opposing perspectives. These sentences right here mask an array of controversies that have ensnared a variety of stakeholders in the Lapindo case. Most significantly, it suggests that the cause of disaster has been settled when what they're presenting is a very controversial stance. So due to lack of time, I'm not going to go over a lot of the controversies that most of you are probably very familiar with. I'm not going to talk about the Bakri family and its responses. I'm not going to talk about government responses at the local and national level, police investigations. I'm not going to talk about the compensation plan, which very clearly also is a man-made disaster. There's been a lot written about it, and I think you could find information about that elsewhere, and I'm happy to chat about it after this talk. Instead, I want to focus on how scientists have been complicit, like what they're doing here, in hiding truths and spreading misinformation, which up to now has indirectly brought harm to Lapindo victims and other communities that are vulnerable to energy mining. Okay. So with that said, let us go back a couple years to another study. And this is one I've written about before. This is a study that comes from a special issue in Marine and Petroleum Geology that focused exclusively on the Lapindo incident. And it was organized by the aforementioned Lucy Lab, which is headed by Mazzini, who is the author of the emissions paper I just mentioned. Now, The greatest scientific controversy that we all know surrounding the Lapindo case has been what triggered the mud flow, the earthquake in Yogyakarta, or the drilling by Lapindo Berantas. Clearly, the majority of evidence indicates that drilling is the cause. Of the studies that suggest the earthquake might be a cause, only a couple were published by scientists who were not affiliated with Lapindo Berantas. In other words, the overwhelming majority of independent researchers found drilling to be the cause. Knowing this and having studied the social dynamics of the Lapindo disaster for over a decade, I was excited when this issue first came out because I was looking forward to seeing if there is a new scientific breakthrough that might illuminate some of the information about the trigger debate. However, upon opening up the article immediately, I was furious once again because it was another one of these disappointing and misleading scientific articles that is causing a lot of harm. Some particular errors in this article stood out to me immediately. First of all, the data that they present is incorrect. They argue that Lapindo is naturally caused and without giving any sort of evidence that supports that. I'm using M&M here, that's Mazzini and Miller, the two authors of the introduction to the special edition. So the authors use deceptive rhetoric and argumentative tactics. They spread unsubstantiated claims of collusion between scientists and media outlets. Basically, they're spreading rumors about scientists who were blaming drilling for the disaster. And they just show a profound lack of knowledge and concern about the social and cultural dynamics in the area, and their research actually does affect those. So altogether, it was unprofessional and an unprofessional and unscientific article that relied on rumors, bad evidence, and personal attacks. When I saw this article, I immediately wrote to the editor of the journal and asked if I could write a response to this article because I was so angry. And I had this plan to write a 1,000-word response. It was going to be pretty short, but I was so angry it actually turned into a 7,000-word article. And the reason why it became so big is because the article that they published was so inaccurate and so wrong. I think it really required care and precision and evidence that needed to be presented in a very clear sort of way in order to really respond and thoroughly to the various crazy claims that they made. So since I'm a scientist, in this article I wrote, I didn't really focus too much on scientific details, although I did point out a couple. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear very well. I'll try to continue onward. I think somebody has their mic on, that's okay. So mostly in this article, I focused on the rhetoric and argumentative tactics that were presented in this article, looking at some of the implications at their lacking knowledge about the social and cultural context of the disaster. So what really struck me about this, and I've said this before, is that the authors of this piece showed no real concern for victims, nor care about the ways their questionable scientific findings can actually intensify the vulnerability of Lapindo victims or any person living near a mining site. So these are what you see are some of the deceptive rhetorical tactics. I am going to talk about one mostly because I don't want to bore you by speaking too much on a Friday night, but I'm going to talk about naturalization, which I think is one that is really important to draw attention to. Naturalization is blaming nature for a disaster. Generally speaking, the naturalization of disaster mutes any sense of human agency or responsibility. In the context of Lapindo, the Miller and Mazzini study does exactly this. They call the mud flow a natural system, a naturally prepared geological phenomenon, a naturally prepared geological system in a critical state and susceptible to small external natural triggers. And most ridiculously, a natural system born a natural birth, now living a natural life, and will ultimately die when ready. In both the humanities and social sciences, when we use the word nature, we make sure we do it with caution because it's a very imprecise word. It can signify just about anything from wilderness to physical laws to behaviors that are seen as abnormal, to anything that's ever actually existed. This computer in front of me, we could say, is natural because it's made out of raw materials and human labor, all which exist within the kingdom of nature, right? So when a word can mean just about anything, it also kind of means nothing. So again, putting on my teacher perspective, when I have a student that uses the word nature in a paper or during a class discussion, I'll stop them and ask them to use a different word. Let's try to find something more precise. What are they actually talking about? And usually things that come up are like storms, animals, geophysical processes. It's a different but much more precise way of analyzing things. It seems like scientists should be a little bit better at this. In the field of disaster studies itself, Kofi Annan's famous statement, Kofi Annan famously said, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. It's a statement that reflects that the mainstream perspective that social elements always to some degree factor into the form and impact of hazards that manifest as disaster. Often when nature has been blamed for a disaster, it has the effect of masking or minimizing the roles that governments, corporations, and systemic inequities play in generating the disaster. We saw this process occurring in droughts in South Asia throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. We see it in more recent earthquakes in Haiti. We saw it in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Tons of tsunamis in Southeast Asia. Once blame is projected onto nature, deeper social and political causes tend to be overlooked, muting the need to address critical social and political issues in all phases of disaster management. Another way of saying this is that, like acts of God, there's no way to stop nature. Thus, if we blame nature, we don't have to look deeper at ourselves and the social institutions that make some regions and populations more vulnerable to disasters than others. It is difficult for me to dismiss the Lucy Lab's naturalized phrasing as sloppy rhetoric. Implied in their piece is a common but imprecise conceptualization of nature that simply describes non-human phenomena like rocks, mud, heat, and water. Thus, sun substitution, like I would do if I was teaching a class, if I asked them to clarify what do you actually mean by natural system? What do you actually mean by natural triggers? I think that's useful to illustrate or to clarify exactly what they're trying to talk about. So natural system, what they're, if I'm inferring what they're trying to describe, actually it describes a non-human system that consists of a network of geological formations and interactions. And natural triggers refers to non-human triggers, which are the earthquake and its attendant impacts on pre-existing geological formations and interactions. In the article abstract of this article that I've been talking about for quite a bit, they also include this sentence early on, quote, "We discuss the initiation of Lucy, highlighting discrepancies and evidence through the published data to build a comprehensive database that emphasizes how the results converge toward a natural scenario of this system." Again, if I were to put on my professor hat and told them to refine this, to make this a more specific sentence by taking out nature and putting what they really mean in there, it would probably look like what I put down here below. We discuss the initiation of Lucy, highlighting discrepancies and evidence through the published data to build a comprehensive database that emphasizes how the results converge towards a non-human or earthquake triggering scenario. So this becomes interesting because suddenly it starts showing that these scientists are actually stepping outside of the scientific method. They are no longer beginning their scientific inquiry by asking hypotheses and testing them and drawing in a range of perspectives and trying to figure out what the actual cause of the disaster is. They're actually trying to build a database that supports their opinions, right? This is not science. And it's really important that this is drawn out. And this is if you were to read that article, that was basically the major argument I was trying to make. There are other rhetorical maneuvers that they use, such as drawing on the passive voice to mask their own kind of complicity in this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it is kind of a nuanced thing that's specific to language. But the more you do this work and try to take apart what they're actually trying to say, the more it becomes very obvious that what they're doing is explicitly manipulating information to build a narrative that they want to disseminate. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. One thing that I also want to draw attention to that involves the Lucy Lab, but it also involves a lot of other scientists, pretty much every scientist who has published an article that's supporting the earthquake as the trigger. They almost all have at one point collaborated with Lapindo Brantas scientists or received funding or support from Lapindo Brantas. Obviously, company scientists have privileged access to information about the mud flow and are clearly knowledgeable about geological considerations related to mining. Yet all reports, presentations, and peer-reviewed publications they have authored or co-authored support the earthquake trigger hypothesis. And so somehow they all keep coming up with the same conclusion. In addition, a study from 2013, the Lupi et al. Study. I'm not sure if for any of you who've been following the science, it's a really unusual study. Lucy Lab, it involved Lucy Lab scientists as well. They received financial support from an NGO that was funded by a Russian energy company that in 2007 received mining concessions from the Indonesian government. Certainly, these documented alliances do not compromise the actual objectivity and findings of these scientists, but they reinforce a pattern of energy interests and national government bodies promoting the earthquake as the trigger with a confidence and unanimity that fails to synchronize with the broader scientific consensus. This pattern becomes all the more concerning with industry stakeholders' reported efforts to manipulate media narratives, which have been well documented by scholars and media observers alike. Even some people in the Zoom room have published on that precise thing, right? Fair or not, a consequence of these perceived efforts is the heightened potential to cloud the reputation of scientists with direct and indirect connections to mining, or energy mining interests. For earthquake trigger scientists who work rigorously and independently to better understand the disaster, perceptions of coordinating with industry interests must be appalling, which underscores the importance of exercising transparency and good faith in all research activities. This includes engaging respectfully with dissenting data and perspectives, an engagement that is absent in the articles I have mentioned. The importance of science. So I'm skipping forward again. I'm going to talk about these scientists' lack of knowledge about the mud flow and its social impact. The importance of scientists and engineers considering the social aspects of their work is no trivial thing. Canonical works in science and technology studies show that scientific objectivity is a situated cultural practice. Furthermore, from Frankenstein to Terminator, there exists a rich narrative tradition in both literature and film that depicts the consequences of scientists failing to consider the social and ethical consequences of techno-scientific enterprise, which reflect real-world concerns about science's long history of fraught entanglements that range from colonial conquest and eugenics to profit motives and warfare. These are, of course, extreme examples, but for many scientists studying the mud flow for over a decade, it is reasonable to expect some consideration of the broader social implications of the trigger debate, including reflection about the ways one's own participation in the trigger debate both shapes and is shaped by above ground events, that is, society, right? At the same time, it is unfair to blame scientists for simply adhering to disciplinary conventions, which involves isolating geoscience from social science. However, the field of science and technology studies shows time and again that isolation of these sciences remains a fictional exercise, akin to analyzing on-field statistics to determine a team's performance in a given sport, when other circumstances like weather, player health, salary caps, coaches, and interpersonal relationships also weigh heavily on determining outcomes. And I apologize for the sports reference. So I'm getting close to wrapping things up. I just want to say that as we get towards the end, in this article that drove me crazy, there's another incredible line that shows up a little bit later. Let me just jump into it. I'll just leave this. In the Lucy Lab special issue, Mazzini at one point characterizes the mudflow as, quote, a natural laboratory for studying geological phenomenon. More appropriately, I would like to argue that it's a natural laboratory for examining scientists in action as they attempt to develop analysis that might stand on its own in the face of conflict. And I'm referencing this quote by Bruno Latour with knowledge standing on its own, that science needs to be engaged with the public in order to be of value, of worth, and to be durable to critique. After 15 years, there exists a rich and complicated trail of publications, reports, media interviews, funding applications, site visits, conferences, presentations, and press releases that detail the activities of scientists throughout the evolution of the trigger debate. Should a side eventually win the trigger debate, the victory would herald the emergence of an analysis supported by a convincing mobilization of evidence, by well-constructed science that shows, that not tells, but shows what the actual cause is. The fact that the Lucy Lab continues to receive funding to conduct research, along with the fact that journals are willing to publish them, indicates certain institutional flaws within the science community. It also serves as a reminder that Western science is neither perfect nor the only useful means of generating knowledge in these discussions. So I want to conclude by noting that perhaps many of the problems that continue to plague Lapindo science since the onset of the disaster are indicative of breakdowns within scientific culture, particularly its colonial structures that express hierarchy, capitalism, exploitation, and appropriation. Here I reference Juno Perennias, who observes that the stakes of colonization involve sovereignty, occupation, and knowledge production. But her research draws her to see decolonization as something a little more deeper, as something oriented towards process and experimentation, and not toward foregone conclusion, except for the need to care about others. Lost in the trigger debate, especially in work by scientists associated with the Lucy Lab, is this orientation towards care. Few scientists have spent time with victims, nor have they seriously considered the stakes of their work. From what I can tell, they view Lapindo only as a geological puzzle, only as a professional problem. They don't recognize that it's also a human problem. They don't recognize that it's a social problem. They don't recognize that it's an ecological problem. Knowledge about Lapindo and its impact, however, continues to grow. And it is my belief that decolonizing Lapindo science with a focus on process and care offers the best guidance for advancing knowledge going forward. Based on my research and the evidence I showed you here, I believe that the best knowledge about Lapindo is not coming from international scientists, but from local communities of victims, scholars, activists, and artists, from ordinary people who have been harmed by Lapindo, along with those who are vulnerable to similar disasters. For this reason, the local community must be supported politically, economically, institutionally, however possible, it must be supported so that they can lead the way as knowledge continues to grow going forward. And thank you. That's it. Terima kasih.
Wow, thank you very much, Phil. It's very dense you are talking about, but thank you for the captions here automatically, because you are a native English speaker, so the Zoom application can translate it good. So I will turn to Judith Bosnak from Leiden University, the Netherlands. Judith, are you here? Hello, Judith.
Yes. Oh, wait a
okay.
second. Yeah, I'm here. I'm just wanting to put on my video.
Can you turn the video?
No, I don't know what happened over here.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah, I made us, yeah, clear in. Okay, thank you very much, Anton, for giving me the floor. And I have to say it's an honor to be here in the middle of two important continents today. Let's say the United States and Indonesia, where we have this very knowledgeable people working together on the Lapindo lumpur, the mud flow. And I think for me, it's very nice and maybe also kind of symbolic that I'm now in Europe in the middle of these two conversations. And I hope that I can add a little bit to that. Pak Suaigit, terima kasih juga untuk semua informasi yang penting, yang sangat menarik. And for the moment, I will continue in English, but if necessary, I could add also something in Indonesian. So what we've learned today, I think the very last words of Phillip are very important, that with time going on, now we are commemorating 15 years of Lumpur Lapindo, and with time going on, the knowledge is growing. And as we've seen Phillip passionately speaking about how angry he became to see this misinformation that is shown all the time around. And I think it's very good to know that with the knowledge that is growing, there will be possibilities, I think, to counter that one day, that misinformation, and especially I think Eutonica, all the teman-teman dari Jawa ya, Anton dan Catur, Mbak Mai di pasar juga, mereka semua membantu untuk ganti idenya mengenai Lapindo. So I think everybody's adding, the people are here present. And first of all, Pak Suaigit, I think it's very interesting and important to know that people, also 15 years after the disaster, they still are living with it daily. They have to cope with bad air. They have to cope with poisoned water. As I understood that even when there are, for example, people washing their clothes, that it turns out to be yellow. So these kind of practical things, daily life really is still impacted by the mud flow. And I think that it's really good that we think about this, and that there is also this concern about health of people, people having their respiratory problems, and so they definitely cannot on with a normal life, even when they try very hard. And I also think it's nice that Pak Suaigit also said that we take the positive stand, we make the best of it, but obviously that is not very easy on a daily basis. Mas Anton, shall I continue about Drake, or shall we wait for some questions for Pak Suaigit first, or how would you like it to move on?
Maybe you can add something about Phillip.
Yeah, okay, good. So I think it's very intriguing from the start how these two opposing ideas, or what actually caused the mud flow, how they have been in people's minds for 15 years, and how especially the idea that it was triggered by an earthquake somehow within the battle has been sort of emphasized as being the winning part. But it has, like Drake also, I think, very interestingly shows, it's a kind of superficial way how you can always turn your arguments. but it's a clever way, and it's not easy to deconstruct. And when I was doing research in 2007 also about the mud flow, and then more concerning media manipulating news about the mud case, I try to delve into the geological data, but for me that's hard because I'm not a specialist. But I could tell, of course, also from the narratives that it was interesting how especially the people linked with somehow with the with Lapindo, how they were able to steer their narrative in such a way that it became very plausible that indeed it was an earthquake at 250 kilometers distance in Yogyakarta really provoked the earthquake, the lumpur, the mud flow. But in fact, right after the mud flow, there were already reports from the gas company itself that there were errors. So from the start, actually, everybody knew that there was something human involved. It might have been a combination maybe of also the earthquake, but still, that it would be totally natural. And to pose it as natural has always been strange. Since in that time, in 2007, I was also in Yogyakarta, and when I came to Surabaya, people complained, how is it possible that there is so much focus on Yogyakarta for the victims of the earthquake and they get money? And how is it possible that we are left behind? So that's what I heard from the people in the field. They felt that there wasn't enough concern for them. And I'm afraid also we learned from all these scientific studies that still the concern is not enough. And to say the least, sometimes even, sometimes like Drake showed us, even lacking. And then the problem is also, if you want to really make a separation between scientific data and other data that can be found by social scientists, if you really want to take that apart, you're in a limbo, I would say. This is just not possible. So it's a big concern that articles seem to not look at the human part of this disaster. And they can steer policies of the governments, of local government, of the national government, and even of these international projects where, as I understand now, there's also a lot of money involved. And of course, if you have in a lab, you have the specific access and you're the one who sort of has the monopoly on monopoly, then you are the one who also is able to write your narratives in such a way that people will believe you. And misleading information until now is being spread. But I think it's very important of these kind of meetings that we try to see into more, that we, as I read also from Phillip, that we should go up ground, not underground. So we should be on the earth altogether and look at the people who are living in these places that are still, and they still have this impact. And we also have to listen to the stories. And we cannot also just delving into the earth and trying to make a possible scenario, trying to deconstruct everything which might have happened. Yes, it's important, but you cannot do that without also working with the people nowadays above the ground and see what their real concerns are. So yeah, I think that is the most important thing I want to add at this moment. Yes, Anton.
Oke, terima kasih Judith. Thank you Judith and Phillip and Pak Sigit. Saya akan membuat semacam beberapa komentar singkat sebelum saya lempar ke audiens. Jadi saya hanya mengulang bahwa poin penting dari Phillip adalah science itu ada persoalan di science as an institutions. So then there is a problem in science as a social institutions. Ini juga menyambung diskusi kita tadi siang bahwa science is a social process. Science itu adalah proses sosial yang itu mungkin sama dengan proses sosial yang lain. Sehingga kredibilitas sains itu sebenarnya diuji. The credibility of science is being tested by producing knowledge about the Lapindo mud flow. Kemudian ada satu catatan penting dari Phillip terkait dengan di mana manusia, where are the humans, where are the local people in this research. Dan yang terakhir adalah menurut saya cukup penting dari Phillip adalah bagaimana kita melakukan perubahan dari para warga. Jadi melakukan perubahan bersama dengan warga dari pengetahuan yang dibangun bersama warga, dan itu juga yang ditekankan kembali oleh Judith. Jadi we are ngomongnya on the ground. So ini yang berbeda dengan. Jadi kita perlu melihat mereka yang tinggal di atas tanah, kira-kira gitu. Oke, saya akan buka termin pertanyaan, atau kalau Pak Sigit ada pertanyaan gitu kepada dua teman kita, yang satu di Belanda sama yang satu di Amerika, silakan loh Pak Sigit untuk memberikan komentar. Mungkin mic-nya bisa di nonaktifkan. Ya, silakan.
Ya, terima kasih. Dari saudara saya yaitu Phillip dan Mbak Judith ya. Saya sangat terhormat sekali berada di depan layar ini, sehingga saya sama sekali tidak mengerti bahasanya. Tapi ya alhamdulillah. Tapi kan kadang-kadang dari bahasa Inggris itu kan ada yang diadopsi ataupun di bahasanya itu di Indonesia kan, sehingga sedikit paham. Cuman alurnya ini tidak seberapa paham, hanya sepatah-sepatah gitu. Tapi alhamdulillah saya sedikit paham, ya sedikit paham apa yang disampaikan. Pertanyaan saya begini, kami ini adalah masyarakat yang buta dengan advokasi. Kadang-kadang kita ini ada istilah tadi, yaitu dekolonisasi, itu ada itu istilah itu saya paham. Jadi kadang-kadang kita ini sedikit dibodohi ataupun tidak diberitahu secara utuh untuk keadaan lumpur Lapindo ini. Sehingga kita sebagai masyarakat ini menjadikan suatu dilematis, mau bergerak seperti ini nanti ada rasa ketakutan, kalau tidak bergerak ini kita juga tidak ada perubahan, ya, sehingga kadang-kadang kita ini untuk meningkatkan kapasitas warga itu kadang-kadang kesulitan. Pertanyaan saya begini, apa yang harus kita lakukan ketika menghadapi musibah-musibah ataupun bencana seperti lumpur Lapindo, agar kita ini tidak miskin informasi, begitu maksudnya. Kadang-kadang informasi itu kadang-kadang dibeli gitu loh. Nah, tidak independen, nah, sehingga sudah divolunteer. Ini sudah sudah dipelintir lah bahasanya. Ya, sehingga bahasa ataupun informasi tadi sudah terbangun, ya, sehingga kadang-kadang kita ini tersandera gitu loh, tersandera dengan informasi yang seperti itu, ya sudah kita terima gitu. Jadi mohon penjelasan bagaimana kita bertindak dan menghadapi situasi yang seperti ini. Terima kasih.
Okay, so the question from Pak Sigit is about how to struggle with this misleading informations from the people perspective. So what we can do together to deal with the misinformation that is spread by the government and other actors. There is a question here. Ada satu pertanyaan. Wah, ini Pak Rum ini pasti ini program studi ekonomi syariah. Mungkin Pak Rum bisa komentar langsung untuk bertanya atau jadi dia bertanya melalui chatbox, frame industry and politik terlihat dominan di penanganan kasus lumpur Lapindo. Kekuatan komunitas cenderung menjadi objek. Seringkali dapat aspek sosial lebih luas diabaikan. Bagaimana komunikasi bersikap bila kekuatan modal memframing? So the question is more about how the relation between the political economy of producing the public information about the Lapindo. I think like that. Okay, I will give the floor to Phil first, and then perhaps Judith mau menambahkan, silakan.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Nino, could you repeat the question that you asked?
From Pak Sigit or from the chat box?
Actually, could you do the chat box? I think, well, I'll talk about Pak Sigit's question first, yes, which yes. I think is probably, to my knowledge, the most important question, and also maybe the one that I'm probably not the correct person to ask, being an outsider in the United States, although I think international research community, social sciences, humanists like myself, and including STEM scientists, they all should be working harder to integrate care into their work and integrate ways of supporting local communities that they interact with, whether it's the Lapindo situation or whatever community there is. And I know researchers in disaster studies are increasingly focused on making sure they're not treating their case studies in a kind of extractive way, as if the researchers are treating like somebody's disaster as if it's a mineral or a natural resource, but as something that's more interactive. And so to me, the most important thing is, at least from this outsider standpoint, and again, I recognize that I have certain limitations, and it's important to recognize those limitations too, because there's important voices that can be crowded out if there are too many international people speaking on behalf of the local community. And so I think the biggest thing is integrating care and throwing support in whichever way is possible. But to me, I think this represents maybe the most exciting part going forward about Lapindo research is what's coming out of the community. What are communities doing to develop resilience? And I know, Nino, you, and having spent a lot of time with Chatur as well, are doing incredible projects involving monitoring emission, or monitoring health, monitoring environmental impacts, trying to track sick people. And so I think there's a lot of exciting work that's being done already that maybe isn't reaching broader audiences, partially because of problems within scholarly and academic institutions, which tend to struggle to get those voices and perspectives brought out. But to me, Mazzini can write as many articles as you want. They're never going to be very interesting because he's lying in every single article. Whereas what's most interesting, I think, is precisely the perspective that Pak Suaigit was presenting at the very beginning of this talk. So which is a roundabout way of saying I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I think that's the most important question.
Jadi kata Phillip, Pak Sigit, jadi itu dia tidak tahu jawaban yang pasti, tapi pertanyaan Pak Sigit itu yang paling penting sebenarnya. Jadi mungkin kita perlu meneruskan apa yang sudah kita lakukan untuk mengembangkannya dengan internasional scholars atau sarjana internasional. Mungkin Judith ada komentar dari pertanyaan Pak Sigit tadi sebelum saya beralih ke pertanyaan Mbak Ica Wulansari.
Ya, mungkin saya juga minta maaf Pak Sigit. kalau ada banyak bahasa Inggris dan mungkin sulit dimengerti ya. Tetapi sebenarnya sebagai peneliti kita juga mungkin harusnya kadang-kadang diam karena harus menunggu sampai orang di Indonesia juga menceritakan kepada kita apa yang sebenarnya terjadi ya, apa yang sebenarnya penting. Jadi saya juga untuk sekarang ini saya sepertinya tidak pas untuk saya untuk menjawab, tetapi saya harap dalam grup ini ada kemungkinan sharing dan juga walaupun ada masalah bahasa, kita harus mungkin juga ya kita harus sabar ya. Dan untuk saya yang paling penting nanti mendengar sesuatu lagi dari Anda. Ya, apa yang sekarang yang penting, apa yang diperlukan, di mana kita bisa bantu. Mungkin kalau kita menceritakan kepada teman-teman bahwa sekarang ini 15 tahun, misalnya di Belanda, orang pasti banyak orang yang tidak tahu. Jadi kita bisa menyebarkan sedikit informasinya. Tetapi dengan itu saya tidak bisa langsung membantu, Pak. Jadi saya minta maaf kadang-kadang ya informasinya miskin ya. Kalau untuk orang di lapangan sana, orang di situ aja.
Oke, jadi Pak Sigit itu respon dari Mbak Judith. Jadi Mbak Judith ini cukup lancar untuk berbahasa Indonesia. Oke, saya akan beralih ke pertanyaan dari audiens, dari Ica. Bagaimana membangun epistemologi pengetahuan di tengah hegemoni atau politisasi pengetahuan dan teknologi oleh pemegang kuasa atau elit? So, how to build epistemology of knowledge in the middle of knowledge hegemony or politicizations and technology also by the elite or based on power or something like that. And then there is a second question from Ahmad Rum Fitrianto. Capital and politics seems frame the Lapindo case based on Phillip, so blah blah blah. To grants and research grant, not only that when I conduct my doctoral degree research, many information has been hidden, such a negativity of Lapindo on social economic aspect. The question, what the community should do to react and respond to the capital and political influence, I think, on Lapindo cases. So, please.
Yeah, well, in some ways, both these questions are kind of approaching similar issues, especially around the sense of helplessness that tends to get fostered when science, capitalism, and power intersect in certain sorts of ways that oftentimes determine what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed. And I think one of the most important things to remind ourselves is that overturning or reworking patterns of hegemony is not something that's done overnight. That involves process, and again, going to this decolonizing framework that I think Perennius puts together really nicely, that a meeting like this is part of the solution, right? An exchange like this is part of the solution and starts moving things in certain directions. Any sort of community engagement it does help this advance a lot of this kind of epistemological shifting that's necessary. I mean, there are broader problems with power that can be quite depressing, especially if we're kind of thinking about the Anthropocene and the politics of fossil fuel extraction more generally, which seems to over and over again overwhelm these types of discussions because there literally is so much money at stake in a lot of these mining projects that, I mean, to me, it doesn't make, the argument that it was caused by an earthquake makes no sense, because if it truly was, it means that Indonesia is an unsafe place to mine altogether. So why would anyone be mining in Indonesia? there's a logical breakdown that just doesn't make sense. Clearly, there's a lot of money at stake, and there's a lot of science, or there's a lot of importance and a kind of financial and political investment in science that supports industry. And so, you know, I don't think it's an easy process, but again, events like this, I think are really important for framing these, or for building opportunities to reframe these discussions, and epistemological change, I think, is part of that. I'm not sure if I'm not answering these questions particularly well, but I'm curious what others might think.
Okay, Judith, do you mau nambahin? Do you want to add something to it? Hello, Judith. Do you want to add something? No.
No, maybe later.
Oke, di sini sudah ada Mbak Dian Harmoningsi. Ini salah satu ini juga berbicara soal tentang pemulihan kekuatan ekonomi, so economic recovery for and confidence, dan percaya diri dari masyarakat sekitar Lapindo untuk bisa bangkit. Oke, ini ada juga satu pertanyaan. Sampai saat ini belum bisa dipastikan sampai kapan. So until now there is no certainty about until when the Lapindo mud flow will continue. But some research says that 30 years, sampai 30 tahun. Until now still 98 meter cubic per day. Adakah kajian untuk atau penelitian hitung-hitungan dampak luas? So is there any research about the impact about the mud flow ecologically or others? So how many the land subsidence until the next 30 years? So how large is, and how many lands that we need to do the embankment for the embankment, and then the new islands that is built, new islands in the estuary of Porong. So is there any research on this? And I have Pak Catur tadi mau bertanya tadi, ada private message ke saya. Silakan Mas Catur.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Nindo. Thank you Phil, Judith, Pak Sigit. For Phil, it's quite questionable for me that companies, state, researcher, and other parties trying to make up the Lapindo to look in the positive way. Like in the first year, they try to create a brick from the mud, and like now they try to create like a geological park in this area. Some researcher found or student, I think in university, found that there are bacteria that could decompose heavy metals. Some other find that the mud contain lithium, and the last one, there were research that found Lapindo mud contain the rare earth metals. The question for Phil, I think, why they keep doing this rather than to see the multidimensional impact of the mud? Why they not to monitor the relief of human rights violation that already found by the Human Rights Commission, or how to reduce the future impact or to relieve the social ecological destruction caused by this mud? Why they are so busy to find something positive? And you know, the question is, nobody knows what the heavy metals contained in the mud, how it spread in the Madura Strait, or how the heavy metal that contained in the mud or on the Porong River already inside in the fish or in the prawn or other consumable food by the community. So it is something interesting. Maybe Phil already gave a sign that there are a lot of capital that influence the science, but I think I want to hear more about it. And for the other audience, I think I would like to share that me, Nino, and other try to membalik apa ya, try to start to answer what happened in the situation by seeing that the question by the community is the priority to do the research. So after we know how to do the community-based research, we try to priority that there are so many questions that need to answer, and it could be found by collaborate with the researcher, the scientists from the university. So we now try to collaborate with university. I know this method of the research during the partnership with the Islamic State University, UINSA, and they also collaborate in the social research in 2016. I think now to balance the information, I think the local science also need to priority to answer the most questionable by the community. I think Pak Sigit already mentioned some question. That's the experience. Now I also still in the experiments. Is it the answer to manage this kind of disaster situation by priority the community issue or community question? Thank you, Phil, Judith, Pak Nino. Terima kasih.
Oke, saya dapat satu pesan singkat dari Siti Maimunah. Mau juga berbicara, silakan Mbak Mai.
Ya, terima kasih Judith and Phil. Sorry, I will speak in Indonesian. Pak Sigit, Phil, dan Judith, terima kasih. Yang pertama saya mengusulkan Yutenika mungkin bisa nanti menerjemahkan dalam bahasa Indonesia transkrip ini sehingga bisa dibaca oleh komunitas. Yang kedua, salah satu yang mengejutkan buat saya, mungkin nggak terkejut juga ya, tapi ternyata ada kalimat itu. Jadi tadi Phil menyebutkan tentang salah satu narasi Mancini itu yang bilang lumpur itu yang alami itu ya akan mati jika dia sudah siap gitu. Jadi kira-kira dia mau bilang begini ya, kalau Tuhan mau itu nanti akan berhenti, kira-kira begitu. Ini pelajaran pertama yang penting dari diskusi ini adalah jadi setiap ada bencana yang disebabkan oleh industri gitu ya, apapun industri itu, baik yang jaraknya pendek maupun Lapindo kan nggak terlalu lama lantas bikin bencana, atau yang panjang seperti misalnya penggudulan hutan gitu ya oleh industri kayu dan seterusnya, itu memang rakyat yang akan nanggung gitu. Jadi biar aja itu berhenti kalau Tuhan menginginkan, kira-kira begitu. Kalau melihat dari kesibukan-kesibukan respon yang diberikan oleh pemerintah, misalnya tadi Catur sempat menyampaikan tentang bagaimana media lebih sibuk memberitakan tentang penemuan litium misalnya gitu, atau tentang proyek wisata skala besar di tempat itu, geopark dan seterusnya begitu. Tetapi orang kemudian hanya mendapatkan satu pintu informasi sedangkan warga dianggap oh mereka sudah selesai karena sudah selesai jual beli. Menurut saya hal yang disampaikan oleh Phil tentang etik untuk peduli gitu ya terhadap kasus di mana rakyat menjadi korban itu menjadi penting. Yang pelajaran kedua menurut saya penting meletakkan selalu orang menganggap bahwa ini tuh laboratorium geologi gitu loh untuk pengetahuan. Menurut saya penting yang disampaikan oleh Phil tadi tentang ini justru laboratorium untuk mengukur kredibilitas para peneliti sebenarnya, para akademisi dan seterusnya. Bisa jadi juga para aktivis begitu ya, untuk pada kasus-kasus yang melibatkan pengetahuan. Saya bahkan seperti yang disampaikan oleh Judith tadi gitu, merasa begitu bicara geologi kita merasa tidak spesialis gitu, sehingga kemudian agak-agak menjauh dan baru tahu setelah merasa 15 tahun refleksi, iya ya itu penelitian kok sebenarnya dia cuma bilang bahasanya alami dan seterusnya begitu. Itu pelajaran kedua yang saya dapat. Yang ketiga seperti yang disampaikan oleh Pak Suaigit dan saya rasa narasumber sebelumnya dari komunitas. Kasus ini penting untuk belajar untuk kasus lain. Misalnya salah satunya ada satu kasus di Sulawesi Tengah tambang nikel di mana masyarakatnya karena kawasan itu tercemar berat, mereka sakit dan mereka mending pindahkan kami gitu. Nggak pernah kita bercakap-cakap bahwa pindah itu tidak mudah dan saya rasa kasus Lapindo ini penting gitu untuk menjadi pelajaran ya. Sebenarnya pindah itu tidak serta-merta kemudian menjawab masalah, tetapi tidak pindah pun juga dilema gitu. Dan kekuatan rakyat menjadi penting. Setelah 15 tahun ternyata yang masih berdiri survive itu ya komunitasnya gitu. Sementara yang lain bisa jadi sudah pergi dari situ gitu ya. Nah pertanyaan saya buat Phil dan Judith sebenarnya satu, buat para peneliti atau akademisi sebenarnya etik seperti apa dari pelajaran dari kasus ini yang penting untuk kita lakukan begitu, para peneliti dan terutama untuk meneliti pada kasus-kasus seperti ini. Terus yang kedua, pelajaran apa buat aktivis sebenarnya yang penting dari sisi pandangan kawan-kawan akademisi begitu ya, untuk karena dalam kasus seperti ini itu seperti kemudian orang masuk dibawa ke isu yang ilmiah gitu, bencana, geologi, ilmiah dan tidak begitu. Nah, apa pelajaran penting dari kawan-kawan untuk memberikan masukan buat para aktivis, mungkin tidak hanya kasus Lapindo tapi bencana industrial yang lain. Terima kasih.
Oke, wow, pertanyaannya cukup padat, tapi mengenai dari soal jadi there are two questions from Siti Maimuna. The first is about what kind of ethics that of doing this research on this case or such a case, not only Lapindo but also in Sulawesi Tengah on the nickel mining. So what kind of ethics as researchers? And the second is about the lesson for activists, so that we are not too academic, we are not too scientific, but also more practical also. Tapi sebelum ke situ saya justru ingin ke Pak Sigit dulu mendengarkan pendapat Pak Sigit tentang komentar Mbak Mai yang ketiga tadi tentang pindah tadi loh Pak. Pak Sigit kan situasinya masih di situ ya, dan Pak Sigit juga walaupun sudah ada tempat lain tapi tetap di situ. Nah, dari perspektif komunitas itu mengapa kok masih bertahan di rumah? Silakan. Mundur suaranya mic Mas Eko.
Ya, oke.
Ya, mengapa masih bertahan di situ?
Ya, terima kasih Mas Nino. Ini yang dikatakan ketangguhan hidup, ya, resiliensi. Begini, kenapa sebagian masyarakat ini masih bertahan di sekitaran wilayah semburan lumpur Lapindo. Karena begini, sedikit banyak kita mempunyai latar belakang, Mas Nino. Latar belakang tersebut yang mendasari kita tidak mudah untuk pindah. Karena apa? Itu tadi loh yang saya bilang, bahwa kita di sekitar lumpur Lapindo itu miskin informasi. Jadi seakan-akan kayaknya masih aman itu. Pertama. Keduanya, nilai-nilai luhur termasuk kearifan budaya lokal, Mas Nino. Ini kadang-kadang tidak bisa kita tinggalkan begitu saja. Itu masih ada kaitannya yang menjadikan ikatan emosionalnya masih erat. Bahwa di kawasan sekitar lumpur Lapindo ini masih dikatakan aman walaupun ada bau-bau yang kadang-kadang mencuat dan juga kadang-kadang masih ada banjir yang kita alami. Begitu, Mas Nino. Jadi garis besarnya pertama, memang kalau kita harus meninggalkan kawasan lumpur Lapindo ini mau pindah kemana, dan itu juga membutuhkan biaya. Nah, biaya itu siapa yang menanggung? Karena begitu, Mas Nino. Artinya ya kita terima apa adanya seperti ini, dan mudah-mudahan juga lumpur Lapindo ini segera bisa ditangani. Begitu, Mas Nino.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Sigit. I will turn to Phillip or Judith first, responding the questions.
Yeah, about this question of the ethics of the doing research. I think in my case, when I tried in 2007 to find information about some cultural interpretations of the representations, let's say in media about the mud flow, first of all, when I came to certain television stations, especially JTV, there seemed to be a lot of hesitant people to give material. So it was very difficult to find out why people were hiding information. So I practically had to make friends with many people first and then see which information they could give me, and then later try to judge what in an ethical way could add to my research. And I think it is always really hard to judge from afar, but also when you're in the field, many people are eager to help you and give you information, but you're never sure if they're also hiding information. And I found out that a series that was made in Javanese, people were not very eager to give it to me, and probably because there was a lot of corruption involved. And later, when I talked later to the actors of the soap, of the Cinetron, apparently they were not paid. So there was a lot behind this whole production. So I think what I learned is just to try to sort of gather enough material, and in a neutral way, as far as that possible, is never possible, to give my opinion and to try to present it in a specific narrative, which for everybody is open to judge. Of course, that's not possible, but I hope that, as opposed to studies of Mazzini, for example, where they really steer you, I think it's the ethics really of us as researchers to try to especially when you know from the beginning, there are two important theories, the triggering part by the drilling of the company and the earthquake. If you know that from the beginning, how can you start making an article only mentioning one or going into one, taking that as a starting point? So I think the ethic for me would be that we should always try to listen to many people and present it as in an order that is then for the people clear enough, or it can help them to make their opinion. And as far as the other question, what I could say for activists, what they could take up is also, I think that I'm not really a person who can give a good answer to that, but I would just hope that I've seen so much courage of many people linked to this group also, and I've seen so much endeavor and good spirit to find out about the truth. So I just really say, go on with that, and there will hopefully be more backup on a certain moment. So I would like to leave it to this, because maybe Phil can say more about this, because he has studied on a longer term the last problems.
Okay, yeah, thank
Phil.
you. I think that, oh.
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry about that. I think that was, Judith, I think that was beautifully said, what you said about the ethics and the activists as well, especially the kind of the bravery and commitments that are constantly on display. And after, I can't even imagine what it must feel like after 15 years continuing that work. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. I would add to that just to say that in terms of the activism, that in my experience, the activists are the smartest and most just the brilliant people that I've encountered from my interactions. I mean, if I've spoken with government scientists, I've spoken with Lapindo scientists, I've spoken with people in the Bakri organization in general. And some of it might just be bad faith discussions, but they just don't seem to understand what's occurring. And it's the activists where I feel like the truth is coming out in these activist activities. And so what I would say is that there are opportunities for social scientists to engage more directly with activists to kind of think of activists as scholars is one way to look forward. And I don't want to be too academic about this, but the kind of Gramscian organic intellectual type of a figure is something that I think is an important model to think about transforming society, is the intellectual that comes from activist communities, that comes from the communities with the most at stake. I think those are the people who should be supported and whose voices need to be foregrounded more frequently. I also think scholars should not be, and this is going to maybe the ethical side, I don't think scholars should be afraid to be more political in situations like this. And as Judith also very elegantly said, the idea that scholarship is apolitical is a fiction. Even a geologist has a politics, and it's very explicit, in the Mazzini articles, but you can detect the politics based on how it's reading. Oftentimes there's a pro-industry bias in a lot of the geological publications, a pro-mining bias that you'll see manifest. I am very explicit that I have a pro-environmental justice bias, a pro-social justice bias, and probably an anti-mining bias. And that doesn't make me a worse scholar, but I do call it, unlike some of the scientists and unlike folks who ignore their own biases, I actually think by acknowledging biases and acknowledging that we're complicated political animals, I think that enables better discussions and better knowledge to be produced. Going back to Chatur's comments, I mean, I just really want to quickly touch on, I think you very rightly touched on the primary problem, and I see in one of the comments somebody mentioned the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, and that's a very good example of the ways that money, I think, really is determining a lot of the activity. And it's not just a little, it's an overwhelming amount of money. And there are, disasters such as this create opportunities for different types of enterprise to thrive. There's also the mentality problem, where for some reason industry just tends to view everything, people, environments, as commodities. And I think that's something that needs to be reworked. And I think the question about epistemology earlier is really important to think about. How do we transform these mentalities to promote justice? How do we center justice as the focus, as a scholarly focus? And then finally, connecting a couple other threads, so there needs to be more resource sources that are given to activists and local scholars. And I don't know enough about Indonesia and what kinds of nonprofits or funding sources or tech, whether it's materials or equipment. I don't know what's available there, but that needs to be developed. And if that's not there, trying to find opportunities through the international community, I think is good. I always think there's a danger of putting too much of a focus on the international community, but I think the main thing is finding ways to support local research. That has to be a focus going forward.
Okay, thank you, Philip, for this, and Judith and Pak Sigit about this. So we are 10 minutes. Apakah ada pertanyaan lain? Is there any other questions? Statement. Oh yeah, there is a question from Asnawi, Phil. Is there any current research about the impact of the socio-ecological impact? Perhaps you should add something on this.
I wish I could add something about this. I actually don't know. I don't know how much, at least in the international, I imagine there's a lot probably going on among local researchers, is my suspicion. Again, since it's been several years since I've been back to Sidoarjo, I'm not quite certain. But in the international community, I am not seeing as much anymore. And I'm not quite sure why that's the case. At least, so on the social ecological side, I'm not seeing anything. To me, it's a terrifying gap in knowledge that we do not know what the environmental impact is, the ecological impact. And it's, again, I think it was 1.5 million euros that the Lucy Lab received to conduct their various studies about whatever, trying to find ways in which they could create a scenario in which the earthquake caused the disaster. That's shocking and horrific to think about, that kind of junk research that's being produced when that money could be being used to answer that precise problem. It's shocking that we don't know so much about social and environmental impacts.
Okay, thank you, Phil, for adding that to our discussion. Ya, memang tidak banyak riset-riset terkait dengan dampak sosial ekologi. Dan sementara Phil tadi juga menyinggung tentang ada jutaan dolar diberikan untuk Lucy Lab gitu. Tapi untuk meneliti sesuatu yang ya kita tidak tahu apakah itu memang beneficial untuk warga dan sekitarnya. Kita sudah 5 menit menjelang jam 9 dan kita akan mengakhiri pertemuan ini, dan menurut saya begitu banyak informasi pengetahuan yang bisa kita serap. Di sini juga ada Mas Rum Fitrianto, dia menulis juga tentang dampak sosial ekonomi terhadap para petani udang, ya, petambak udang. Nah, sekaligus juga saya ingin menambahkan bahwa kami acara diskusi ini adalah sebuah rangkaian panjang untuk membangun sebuah portal, membangun sebuah depo pustaka, digital repository, yang berisi tentang segala macam informasi. Harapan kami, baik itu yang pro maupun yang kontra, baik itu yang mendukung maupun yang tidak mendukung, tapi kita berusaha untuk menyampaikan apa adanya tentang hasil-hasil penelitian itu dalam sebuah website yang berjudul, saya bisa share sedikit ya. Ini baru prototype, saya hanya kita rilis sejenak. Berjudul ini. Jadi bencanaindustri.info. Jadi kita akan merilis ini, nanti kita berharap akan ada apa namanya depo pustaka, ada wacana apa sih bencana industrial itu dari rangkaian webinar yang sudah kita lakukan, diskusi yang sudah kita lakukan, riset-riset pustaka juga yang sudah kita lakukan. Kita juga akan membangun berita-berita tentang lumpur Lapindo, baik itu yang terbaru maupun yang lama-lama. Dan juga nanti akan ada depo pustaka ini akan berisi semacam hasil-hasil riset dari para peneliti itu, sehingga kita bisa menentukan kredibilitas sebenarnya dari para peneliti itu. Jadi the credibility of scientists. So kita sedang membangun portal ini, tapi masih perlahan-lahan karena persoalan sumber daya manusia dan juga finansial yang harus kita hadapi, tapi kita pelan-pelan akan membuat semacam portal ini sehingga apa yang terjadi di Porong itu bisa diketahui oleh banyak orang, tidak hanya warga Porong saja, tapi juga mungkin siapapun yang tertarik untuk mengetahui ini. Dan dengan teknologi digital ini kita berharap bisa menjangkau lebih banyak pihak. Nah, saya rasa, saya coba tutup dulu. Saya akan memberikan closing statement gitu ya, memberikan kesempatan untuk membuat pernyataan penutup gitu. Saya akan mulai dari Judith dulu, closing statement gitu, pendek saja, singkat. Setelah itu Phillip, kemudian Pak Sigit yang terakhir. Karena Pak Sigit tadi yang membuka ya. Jadi saya beri kesempatan terakhir ke Pak Sigit. Silakan Judith dulu.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be joining this session. And I think what is most important for what I learned today and over the years, that we should try all to fight misinformation and to try to see if we can find some kind of truth that is helpful to the people in the field, in the neighborhood of the mudflow.
Oke, terima kasih Judith. Thank you Judith. Phillip?
Yeah, I will echo that. I mean, I think the pursuit of truth and working through misinformation is vital to promoting justice in the long term. And as somebody who's my PhD's in literature, oftentimes narratives tend to be diminished in scholarship and not paid a lot of attention to. And I think the Lapindo case is a really good example of how powerful, sometimes for good, but oftentimes dangerously so, narratives can be. And so we need scientists who focus on biology, on ecology, but we also need people who focus on literature, on narratives, on performance, on art, on politics, and mobilizing all these resources, especially at the local level, is really exciting. And I will just finally say thank you very much, and I'm so excited about the repository that you're building, because I think that's an incredibly valuable resource that will be offered an opportunity for local research to develop onward. So thank you for doing that.
Okay, thank you, Phillip. I hope we can discuss this more if my visa has granted, so we can discuss more intense. Terakhir Pak Sigit, silakan. Ya. Kalimat penutup.
Ya, kalimat penutup. Terima kasih. Syukur alhamdulillah malam hari ini, malam ya di Indonesia ini ya. Saya pribadi bisa berdiskusi bersama saudara saya yang ada di Kansas ya, yang ada di Kansas, Phillip, kemudian yang ada di Belanda Mbak Judith, kemudian ada Mbak Siti Mamunah, ada Mas Catur, Mas Nino. Terima kasih kami bergabung di komunitas ini, memang sangat membantu sekali ketika kami membutuhkan informasi-informasi dan sekaligus untuk peningkatan kapasitas komunitas, karena lumpur lapindo ini sudah menjadi isu dunia ya, isu internasional ya, sehingga akademisi-akademisi yang berada di luar negeri ini keinginan tahunya sangat kuat untuk meneliti, memberikan informasi, kemudian edukasi dan juga sekaligus peningkatan sumber daya manusia di sekitar Lumpur Lapindo. Begitu Mas Dino, terima kasih. Akhirussalam, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat malam.
Waalaikumsalam. Oke, terima kasih rekan-rekan semuanya. Saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada audiens yang hadir pada Jumat malam Sabtu ini, weekend tapi cukup padat. Phillip di Lawrence, Kansas, Judith di Leiden, Pak Sigit di Porong, Mas Catur di Sidoarjo, di Buduran, Mbak Siti di Mbak Mai di Pasau, dan kawan-kawan yang lain dimanapun Anda berada. Terima kasih dan sampai jumpa di kesempatan yang selanjutnya bulan depan. Kita akan bicara tentang dekolonisasi cakap bencana. Jadi bersama Hendro Sangkoyo, saya akan share screen sejenak. Jadi dekolonisasi cakap bencana dari Hendro Sangkoyo. Nanti kita juga sedang mencari testimoni dari warga dan nanti akan ditanggapi oleh Rita Padawangi dari Singapura. Kita nggak tahu ini akan berbicara tentang apa, tapi saya rasa ini sesuatu yang tidak kalah menarik dari apa yang sudah kita diskusikan malam ini dan merupakan satu kerangkaian tentang bagaimana kita melakukan dekolonisasi atau meraih kembali supremasi pengetahuan kita dalam kasus Lumpur Lapindo. Oke, terima kasih. Selamat malam dari Surabaya, selamat pagi di Kansas, dan selamat siang di Leiden. Sampai jumpa.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Judith. Makasih, Pak Sigit. Assalamualaikum.
Terima kasih. Oke.